probably know of her, but you probably don't know about the story she's going to share. I would like to tell our Zoom audience to please, thank you for attending. Thank you for tuning in. And I would like to remind you, during the Q&A session, after Dr. Barbara Nevergold finished her presentation, to please put your questions in the chat area. That means you're going to have to type. I'm so sorry, but that is the best way we can keep up with everyone. And again, thank you all for attending. And right now, I'm going to introduce our presenter for this evening, Dr. Barbara A. Seals Nevergold. A native of Louisiana, Barbara moved to Buffalo in 1947 when her parents joined the Great Migration to the North. The historic exodus of Blacks from the South. In 1966, she began her career as a French teacher in the Buffalo Public Schools. Subsequently, she worked in the fields of health education, social work, and higher education administration. From the fields of health education, and like I said before, social work and higher education administration. From 2012 to 2019, she was a member of the Buffalo Schools Board of Education. Thank you for your service. And she co-founded the Uncrowned Queens Institute in 1999, and I remember that historic time, and dedicates her time now to researching, documenting, preserving, and sharing the history of Buffalo's African-American community. Again, thank you, Dr. Nevergold. Thank you so much, because we do need people to preserve that legacy. And I present to you Dr. Barbara Nevergold, because she has a story to tell you. Thank you. Okay.
Maybe I'm not technological. Okay. I think, can people hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so I'll just have to talk a little bit louder. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction, and thank you to the Michigan Avenue Heritage Commission for putting together these talks. That, as Jennifer said, it's so important for us to know the history of individuals in this region, particularly when there's so much history that we don't know, that's been lost, stolen, or strayed, to use a title from I think it was a video series from the 60s, but it's just as apropos today as it was in the 60s. I'm going to start off with the following. It's from the Tulsa Race Riot and Massacre. Once those sounds in all directions, firearms cracking everywhere, men and women all excited, cries of rioting fill the air. Men with guns and ammunition rushing madly to the fray, shooting, cursing, laughing, crying. Come on, boys, come on this way. They are trying to lynch our comrade without cause and law defy. Get your guns and help defend him. Let's protect him, win or die. 'Twas the cry of Negro manhood, rallying to the cause of right, ready to suppress the lawless, anxious for a chance to fight. So they marched against the mobbist, gathered now around the jail, while the sheriff stood there pleading, law and order to prevail. Thus responding to their duty, like true soldiers they were, Black men faced the lawless white men under duty's urgent spur. Those words were written by an eyewitness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Those words were written by the individual I'm going to talk to you today about, Andrew Jackson Smitherman. And I use the pen warrior in defense of his people because he was a journalist he was much more than that, but we'll talk about that as we go along. Now, I didn't start out to really do research on Mr. Smitherman. I didn't know anything about him, even though he operated a newspaper on Broadway, near Pine Street, or actually probably at Ash, 234 Broadway. And I lived on Walnut Street near Broadway. He died in 1961. I was about 17 then, but I never heard of him, never heard of the newspaper that he had run for like 30 years. And in 2003, Jennifer mentioned the Uncrowned Queens Institute that Peggy Brooks Bertram and I co-founded. And the purpose of that institute was to really document and define the histories of women, Black women in this area. So we weren't really focused on men at all. And we, in 2003, 2004, I think even 2002, we had an annual conference where we brought in people from around the country to talk about women's issues, particularly as related to preserving that history or finding that history and documenting it. And in 2003, we brought this lady, her name is Eddie Faye Gates. She has since passed, unfortunately, but she was from Tulsa, an educator. And at the time, she was a member of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission. And you notice I said race riot. Things change, fortunately, as people get educated. But at one time, the Tulsa incident was known as a riot. And so later on, they changed the name of it to really reflect what happened. And they now call it the Tulsa Race Massacre. But at any rate, Ms. Gates came in and she talked to us at the conference. She was our major speaker. And in the process of talking to us, she said something about, well, you know, you had Mr. Smitherman here, who was involved in the race riot at the time. She was actually, her job on the commission was to interview survivors of the massacre. So she had interviewed maybe about 200 people, I think, at that time. And one of those people was the daughter of Andrew Smitherman. So when she brought up the fact that she had interviewed the daughter and that he was here, and it just struck me like, well, who was this man? Why don't I know about him? I wasn't, so young that I shouldn't have known about the newspaper, but I had no knowledge about it. And so that began to spark my interest in researching Mr. Smitherman. The other thing, we can go on to the next, that sparked my interest and continued was the fact that in 2007, Peggy and I went to Oklahoma. We spent really a year in Oklahoma, back and forth. Peggy. She presented a poem that Drusilla Dungy Houston had written called America's Uncrowned Queens. And that seemed to really fit what we were doing. That is, again, finding, documenting, preserving, sometimes excavating the histories of Black women that have not been documented and are unknown. So as a result of Peggy's research, we decided that in 2007, Oklahoma was celebrating the centennial of the state becoming the state from 1907 to 2007, and that we were going to apply to be an organization to actually officially be named to do a project in Oklahoma. And it was called the Uncrowned Queens of Oklahoma. And we, as I said, we spent the year there traveling, going from Oklahoma City to Tulsa, to Enid, to Norman, to Altos, all over the state, meeting wonderful women but also me having an opportunity to broaden my research on Mr. Smitherman. So that's kind of how we got from Buffalo to Oklahoma, and how that connection was made through these various introductions through Eddie Fay, and then of course during the time that we spent in Oklahoma. Next. So who is Mr. Smitherman? Well, Mr. Smitherman came from Alabama originally. He and his family moved to Oklahoma when it was still a territory in the late 1890s. He was a teenager, about 16, and he went to the University of Kansas, but he came back to Oklahoma after he graduated, and he went to Muskogee. And in Muskogee, a friend of the family's named W.H. Twine, who was an attorney, had a newspaper called the Scimitar, the Muskogee Scimitar. Now, Mr. Smitherman did not study journalism. He actually wanted to come and work with Mr. Twine as an attorney, to study, to be an attorney. And, but he found that he was interested in the paper, and the paper was struggling. And Mr. Twine gave him an opportunity to take that struggling paper and work with it. And he did. And over the time that he worked from 1908 to about 1911 or so on the Muskogee Scimitar, he began to learn journalistic skills. And in 1912 or so, he decided to branch out on his own and do the Muskogee Star. So this is where his journalism started, with that. After about a year, he decided to go to Tulsa. Tulsa was an up-and-coming city, up-and-coming community. As we know by now, there was a very vibrant African-American community in Tulsa. The Tulsa Black Street, Black Wall Street, I guess it has come to be called. But it was a very active, part of Tulsa. Essentially, the Black part of Tulsa, with businesses like a hotel, like a movie theater, like restaurants, of course, like libraries, all of the kinds of things that in a civilized society one would have. But it was all owned, controlled, managed, initiated, started by African Americans. And in Tulsa, Mr. Smitherman established the Tulsa Star newspaper. It was the first African American newspaper in Tulsa, and as a testament to his entrepreneurship, perhaps, he also founded this was a weekly, but shortly thereafter, he also founded a daily Black newspaper. It didn't run for very long because of the expense, but for a year or two, he also had the Tulsa Daily Black Star as the first African-American daily newspaper in the country. Next. So here you get a chance to see the Tulsa Star, the banner and so forth was there. And one of the things that is important to know about this man is that what I found is, one, he was a very brave man. He was a very ethical man. And he challenged the society. He challenged the structure of the society, recognizing that Blacks were at the mercy of whites, particularly when it came to lynching, particularly when it came to segregation. And this was at the time, again, that the Plessy versus Ferguson has really taken hold. And so they're separate and equal. But he spoke out against those things. He spoke to African Americans about the need for them to protect themselves. He believed that we, African Americans, had a right to be armed, had a right to protect their property, their lives, their families. And it was not just a fight and so forth. I mean, he went to the administrators, he went to the government to make that pitch as well, but also to the community to say that we should fight back when attacked. The lynching, of course, was sometimes a daily occurrence. And we should understand, and it's very rarely talked about, that women were lynched as well as men. And so one of the things that he did in the paper was to document those lynchings, was to write articles and editorials decrying those lynchings. And what was really appalling to him was the fact that the individuals, the whites who were committing the lynchings, felt so entitled that many times they didn't feel a need to cover their faces. You know, they knew they weren't going to be have to be responsible or accountable for their actions, and so they were bold enough to do whatever they did unmasked. So he called them mobbists as a result of that. In his career in Tulsa, during the time he was there, very active in the community. He was a justice of the peace, you see there. He formed African American Election Board of Electors. He, and said, was just, we talked about the Black vote, founded a library for Black citizens. So again, this was a community builder par excellence. There were others that he worked with, but through his paper and through his editorials and his writings, he promoted a lot of what he thought, you know, that African Americans should do with respect to making sure that they exercise their freedoms. Certainly, as I said, the fight against white supremacy was ongoing. And there were a couple things that he did, I said, in terms of the lynching. This man actually intervened in a lynching. He heard of a man who was being threatened in Bristol, Oklahoma, which is not that far from Tulsa. I think about a 45-minute train ride. And he actually got on the train and went to Bristol and intervened in this attempted lynching, really kind of shaming maybe, or insisting that the sheriff do his job and protect the man who was in jail that time from lynchers. In another instance, there was a Black man who was being transported from one town to the other to jail. But in the process, it came about that there were men who were going to lynch him on his route to being taken to jail. Black men then got into cars and they were racing across the country, across the countryside in Oklahoma to try to prevent the lynching. Ultimately, the man was safely moved and incarcerated, and he wasn't lynched. But these were reactions to Smitherman's urging Blacks to take on their rightful rights in protecting themselves and protecting others, particularly when there was an injustice, when he saw that there was an injustice taking place. If he said that if the person had done the deed, if the Black person or white person had done the deed, they should be punished for it. However, what very often, as we know, the Black person was punished whether they were guilty or not. Next. So what happened, and to start this whole chain of events that led to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. In the corner up there, you see a little picture of a young man named Dick Rowland. Dick Rowland was about 18 or 19 years old, worked downtown as a bootblack, shining shoes. And there was no lavatory in the area where he was, except in one building. And for Black people, because again, we're segregated in separate lavatories, et cetera. The lavatory that he could use in this particular building, the Drexel building, was on an upper floor. A white girl by the name of Paige, and I'm blanking on her first name right now, but she was Sarah Page. She was operating the elevator. Going up on the elevator, something happened. I don't know, maybe they think maybe he tripped and stepped on her foot, but she yelled. He got out of the elevator and he ran, assuming again that he was not going to be believed, that he was going to be accused of trying to rape her, which he was. And the next day he was arrested. He was incarcerated and he was held on the top floor of the jail, supposedly in a very secure cell, protected, that not, up the stairs, and so it was not easily accessible by a group. And the sheriff thought he could protect Dick Rowland. However, Andrew Smitherman and other Black men that time knew that there was a young white man a year before who had been incarcerated in that same jail, who had been taken out by a mob and lynched. So they did not see that necessarily as their protection. That night, on May 31st, when Dick Rowland was arrested, there was an article in the newspaper that was really incendiary, that kind of threatened that a lynching was going to happen. And Black men became very concerned, and white men, they realized, began to gather outside of the jail. And the Black men, about 25 of them initially, met in Smitherman's office to determine what they should do. So what they decided to do is they called the sheriff and they offered their services to the sheriff to help protect Dick Rowland. The sheriff said, no, I don't need you. I've got it under hand. Don't worry about it. So still, they weren't satisfied with accepting that. So a small group went down to the jail, and again, the sheriff declined their support, but they noticed that the crowd was getting larger and larger, and the emotion was getting more and more out of hand. They left. Later on that night, a larger group of Black men came back, about 75 or so, and this is 1921 now. So we've had World War I, and during World War I, many blacks were in the army. They fought in World War I. When they came back, they had their guns, they had their uniforms. They also had a belief that they should expect some appreciation from their country for having helped them. And they believed that perhaps things would change and that they would be treated more fairly and treated more equitably. So at any rate, they had guns. When this small group, 75, where there were hundreds now of white people around Dale, came back, someone said, N-word, give me that gun. And that didn't happen. A shot rang out, white man fell dead. And as the sheriff said, all hell broke out. And that's where we come. And so what you see here is some more of the poem that I recited at the beginning. It's a very lengthy poem, but as I said, it is the remembrance, and done fairly soon after all of this happened, by Andrew Smitherman. So it is a firsthand account in verse of the massacre and what happened. Can we have the next one? These are some pictures again from that, from Tulsa. It was burning. There was looting. There were fire bombs. There were even planes, and that's been disputed. But there are eyewitnesses, African Americans, who say there were planes that flew over and dropped bombs on the community as well. And people were arrested and crowded into a convention center or a stadium. Go to the next one. So here you see some of the people being detained after the event happened. And this is what the loss amounted to. And I would say, I knew that there were 10,000 people who were homeless as a result of this burning of Greenwood. I didn't realize until I was kind of preparing for this and looking back through the notes that there were only 11,000 residents in Greenwood. 10,000 of them were made homeless as a result of this. Smitherman himself lost his printing plant and his home, about $40,000, at that time. So by now you realize it's hundreds of thousands of dollars that he lost. Next. When a jury was convened, a grand jury was convened after, right, because it went from May 31st to June 1st. That was the period of time. And you can see from the date there, June 6th, they already had convened a grand jury and had determined that there were a number of Blacks who had incited the riot. Andrew Smitherman was named as one of those individuals who incited the riot. He did not think that he would get a fair trial. He was released on bail, and he did wind up leaving with his family because he really didn't think that he was going to get a fair trial in this. The emotions were very high, and of course, fairness sometimes is not, justice is not forthcoming, and particularly at that time. Next. He went to Boston. He went to Kansas City for a minute, and then he wound up in Boston with his family. And here you can see the picture of the family, a little bit more of the poem. And this is chilling in that there's a part of the poem that describes a mother and her children in the basement of their home. And they can hear the looters and, the potential lynchers and white men coming to the house, coming to loot the house, coming to burn what they didn't loot. And so they're in the basement hiding, and the poem describes the conversation that the children are having. Sometime several years ago, again, as I was doing the research on this, I found an interview with Carol Smitherman, Smitherman's oldest daughter, and she talked about that night and how frightened they were and how they could hear the men up over them, stomping around in the house, breaking things, stealing things, starting a fire. Ultimately, fortunately, they got out and died. But so the accuracy of this poem was documented by his daughter. When they went to Boston, they didn't have any money. They were destitute. And they went to the NAACP and asked for support. They lectured. And in this instance, Mrs. Smitherman, who had been somewhat of a drama person, and the children recited the poem, and they dramatized it. They dramatized that part of the poem as a way of raising some money, but also, of course, telling the story of what had happened to them. But they didn't have money, and they were hoping to get it. And Smitherman was lecturing. He was trying to do some writing as well. In January of 1922, he wrote an article that earned him a little money. Again, it was not so much for the money as it was to get the story done. But the fact of the matter was they were destitute. Remember, they lost everything, and they just got out of Tulsa with their lives. Next. When Smitherman, when it was known that he was going to write this article, his view of the race massacre, immediately Richard Lloyd Jones, who was the cousin of Frank Lloyd Wright, and the editor of this Tulsa Tribune, which was very, very anti-Black, immediately wrote to the governor of Massachusetts, indicating to him, stop Smitherman, he's a fugitive, he's wanted by 3 governments, don't let him write, what have you. Fortunately, Smitherman had written the article that was published in the Boston Herald, I think. We'll see it in a minute. But there's not very much else that Smitherman wrote about his experiences as a result of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The next one. So here's the article, Will Tulsa Riot Horrors Awaken America's Indifferent Attitude? Do you think that's a appropriate title for something today? I mean, this is 1922. It might as well be 2023 in the title. And what he said in writing this article, he wrote to the NAACP head, Walter White, at the time. What he said was that he had 3 goals he wanted to accomplish in this. He wanted to show the guilty hand of the Tulsa people, the mobbists, again, as he called them, who perpetrated this horror on a whole, citizenry of people, over 11,000 people. He wanted to talk about the need for assistance to that. He was talking about reparations, okay? That's what he wanted. As a matter of fact, this wasn't the first time he talked about reparations. In some of the other cities we went to where there were lynchings that had occurred, there were also at times several communities that were burned. Again, that were partially burned, homes that were destroyed by white lynchers. And for each of those, when Smitherman wrote about them in his paper, wrote about those incidents, he also talked about reparations. They used the word reparations, that's what was needed to make these communities whole again. So this is what he's asking for Tulsa. And he also wanted to encourage the passage of the Dwyer Bill. Now, the Dwyer Bill was an anti-lynching bill that was introduced in 1921. Do you know when it was passed? Anybody? 2021. Yes, 2021. 100 years later, the Dwyer Bill was passed. So, I don't know what to tell you, but at any rate, we move on. Let's go on to the next. So, as I said, he wanted to show the guilty hands of Tulsarites. And interestingly enough, right after the massacre, many of the newspapers talked about how terrible it was. They talked about, that those villains, those people had embarrassed those who were engaged in the massacre, had embarrassed themselves and the community, and that they needed to be brought to justice. They wanted to reach out and help the Black people who had been harmed. But that didn't last very long. That, those editorials that were first published the first week, maybe the second week, by the third week or the fourth week, they're already saying, they did something, the Black people kind of instigated this riot. So it, really wasn't them. It really wasn't us, it was them. So the blame the victim, came very quickly. Next. As I said, he wanted to get reparations for the victims of this tragedy. And, again, this is a man that had a first row view of what had happened, but also it had happened to him and to his family. It had happened to people that he lived with, people that he was friends with, people that he worked with. So it was a loss that was multiplied by so many different factors that he was trying to, again, ensure that they were made whole, or that at least there was a recognition that there was a need for extraordinary assistance. I would say also, I don't think I have it here, but there was actually a land grab attempt. And so whites came in and they wanted to buy up the land that Black Wall Street had, and it wasn't called Black Wall Street then, so I'm not going to call it that now, but that the Tulsa had been Black Tulsa. They actually called it Little Africa at one point, whites did. But they wanted to buy up that land. And if any of you know John Hope Franklin, a very noted Black historian, his father was an attorney, Buck Franklin, at the time, and he and other Black attorneys came together and they prevented that from happening. But that was, again, part of what happened with Tulsa that a lot of people don't know. And when I mentioned the number of people who were killed, Blacks and whites, the numbers were certainly underestimated for Blacks. There's a belief that there were at least 300 people killed. The records say maybe 30. Right now, even there is an excavation of an area that there's a belief that there are mass graves. And so the state of Oklahoma originally ordered through the new commission, the Race Massacre Commission, to explore that burial ground. They think it's a burial ground. But there's been a lot now of dissension and a lot of pushback over actually trying to uncover if that is a grave site or not. So they're at a standstill from what I understand. Okay, next. Okay, I think we can go on. So what I was saying there is that essentially Smitherman's question about the indifference of Americans to what happened in Tulsa was answered, because the whole story of Tulsa, any notion that there had been a massacre there, that there had been, a vibrant community that was destroyed, was hidden. It was hidden for decades. And there were people in Tulsa who had lived there all their lives and had no idea, because people didn't talk about it, because it was quiet, it was silent, it was something that was hidden away. Again, unfortunately, Tulsa is an example of numerous massacres and destruction of Black communities in this country, of which we know little to nothing about. We're beginning to talk about them, beginning to uncover them, but there's still a lot of work to do. Mr. Smitherman, after living in Boston, moved to Springville for a year or so, and he started another newspaper called The New World. I have not been able to find that paper or any copies of that paper, so it seems like it hasn't been preserved at all. But then he came to Buffalo in 1925, and I think he came to Buffalo because one of his brothers lived here. I don't know for sure, but for several years, he worked as kind of a freelance writer, and he wrote for other newspapers. But in 1932, he decided he wanted to and had the funds, thanks to his wife and her support, to open another newspaper. As you can see, he was very stuck on the word star. So we had the Muskogee Star, we had the Tulsa Star, and now we have the Buffalo Star. And somewhere later in the 40s or so, he changed the name to the Empire Star. But he started the Buffalo Star in 1932. And again, it was a newspaper that spoke the truth, that as he saw it, as he believed it to be. Most Black Americans at that time were Republicans. He was a Democrat, and that was kind of very unpopular. But he felt that the Republicans took the vote from African Americans for granted. He felt that the Democrats, because they knew they weren't going to get the vote, tried to suppress the Black vote. So he thought that if African Americans also became Democrats, they'd have a greater chance of using their vote, of magnifying their vote. So he became a Democrat, and his paper was on a Democrat leading. But he became very, very involved, and as we say, with Uncrowned Queens, became a community builder, or I think he was always a community builder, but he began to work in Buffalo as someone who was seen as contributing and seen as accomplished, was respected for who he was. He ran the newspaper from 1932 to 1961. During that time, and one of the things that we're fortunate to have is that he started to write his autobiography in 1960. He serialized it so that he wrote, each week he wrote a new section of his autobiography in his newspaper. He did about 40 or so parts of his autobiography. He didn't get to the Tulsa Race Massacre, unfortunately. He got about as far as, I think, his early days with the Tulsa Star. But again, he was in the process of writing when he had a heart attack at his desk. And that ended that. But we do have that autobiography, which talks about his early life, again, the development of his philosophy, some of his activities. We have the newspapers from the Tulsa Star. We have some of the newspapers from the Muskogee Star that have been preserved. And we have the Buffalo and Empire Star that have been preserved in order to learn about this man. Some of the things he did here, besides the newspaper, he ran for council, for Buffalo City Council. He was great friends with Reverend Nash. Matter of fact, Mr. Smitherman was also a poet, as you can see from the poem I read, but he wrote a little book called A Treasure Trove of Poems, and Reverend Nash wrote an introduction or a preface to that book. And I don't know if I think this is a couple of things here. This is when I went to, oh, I almost forgot. I don't know if there's another slide in there. I think that's the last one, isn't it? No, it isn't. Thank you. After learning about this man and reading about him and understanding, the quality of this individual, I realized that, again, he was indicted for inciting the race massacre. And that indictment was still active. And in 2007, I decided that I was going to write to the district attorney in Tulsa and provide him the history of Mr. Smitherman's activities here in Buffalo, to say that this is a man who should have his record expunged. The DA took a look at what I presented, and he decided that, yes, after 80 some odd years, it is time to have justice, he said, and he decided to expunge the records of all 54 Black men who had been indicted for inciting the race riot. So some 86 years. So Dr. Bertram and I, in one of our numerous trips, you can see here, we are actually with some of, at that time, some of the women and men who were children during that time, in 1921, and were survivors of the race massacre. And we got a chance to meet them and talk to them and get some of their stories. And again, we were doing at Uncrowned Queens of Oklahoma. We produced a book. We produced some other material on the survivors. We're very thankful that they trusted us to be able to tell their stories. We'll go on to the next one. This is the Greenwood Cultural Center. So when the DA decided he was going to expunge the records, I was going to do it in a formal hearing. And Peggy and I went to Tulsa in December 2007, I think it was. Yeah, December 11, 2007. If you notice the ice on the trees, there was an ice storm, and it was the worst ice storm that they had in Oklahoma in a century or something like that. We got into Oklahoma just before the ice storm, and we had to leave one hotel because they lost all their power. And we got to another hotel, and when we got here to the Greenwood Cultural Center, the mayor came, the county exec came, some other dignitaries came, and they all said some of them had lost power. They hadn't had power for a couple of days. They were sorry they weren't able to do their hair or whatever. But the city hall was closed because they had no power. The college was closed because they had no power. The county building was closed because they had no power. The Greenwood Cultural Center had power. So, God said, let there be power here and let there be a ceremony on this day. That's where we had, and the Greenwood Cultural Center is dedicated. It's in the Greenwood area. It's dedicated to the Greenwood area of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Can we have the next slide? Yeah, so here we are with DA Tim Harris. And we're going to go on to the next one. And there are the names of some of the men who, along with Mr. Smitherman, were indicted: Peg Leg Taylor, Curly Walker, Chester Ross, Big Fred. So hopefully some of their families, did recognize that their members of their families were finally given, peace, and they rightfully, were forgiven this egregious indictment. Next one. And again, some of the ceremony, the judges also, Judge Harris, who presided over the expungement ceremony. Next. When I went there, I wanted to take some remembrances of Buffalonians who knew Mr. Smitherman at the time. And so I did this pamphlet. I had interviewed Jesse Nash, Thelma Hardiman, who had been a reporter. Actually, I think she was the society reporter. And those of you who know Thelma know that that's exactly right for her, right? Garfield Hinton, who was a journalist as well, and worked for the Star. I was able to get a quote from him. So, it gave the connection to the fact that Mr. Smitherman really became engaged in Buffalo. The picture that's on the front of this, I want to also acknowledge the Buffalo Urban League for allowing me to use this picture, because I was looking for pictures of Mr. Smitherman, couldn't necessarily find any, but I was at the office one day and I saw this picture hanging on the wall and recognized who it was and asked them if I could use it. And they graciously said yes. So that's that. And I want to close, I think, pretty much the next one. The centennial of the Race Massacre was, of course, in 2021. And both Peggy Bertram and I developed presentations to mark that centennial. And this is a flyer that I did just to acknowledge all of the things, or some of the things that I was talking about with respect to Mr. Smitherman. It essentially, kind of wraps up some of his life, but by no means, does it cover everything. But I did want to close with a piece from a poem again that speaks to the ethics of this individual. My credo is what he called it, and he wrote it in 1931. And he says, to hope when life itself seems hopeless, to smile when most men would be in despair, to face both good fortune and disaster, and treat them both as though I do not care, to speak when good may come by speaking, to silent be when that is for the best, to listen well when gossip comes with rumors, to count the good and discount all the rest. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation. I think but we have some time for questions and answers. Yeah. Yes. He had an office at 234 Broadway. That's at which I think is like Broadway and Ash Street. And that was one of the offices. I think the last one that he had, he did have several offices. Again, it was expensive running the paper. And so he was challenged quite often to get that paper out on time. And so that I don't know all of the offices that he was located at. As far as where he lived at one time, he lived at the Y. He and his wife separated. They never divorced because they were devout Catholics. But he lived at the Y, MCA in Michigan for a while. But he also sometimes lived in the an apartment behind the shop, wherever that was. That might not have been the one on Broadway. But when they first came, he lived on Purdy Street. And if some of you know Mrs. Eureka Messiah, he lived in the same house. He and his family lived in the same house that Mrs. Messiah and her family lived in, a two flat house, and was at 310 Purdy Street. And she talks about the fact that he, really taught them about Black history, and that she saw him as a very nice man. I mean, she's a child, but she had some very good memories of him growing up. But that's where he lived, I think, at one point when he first came to Buffalo. I don't know. Perhaps it may have been because of the NAACP, the fact that he knew Walter White. Walter White actually went to Tulsa after the riot to investigate. Walter White was the secretary of the NAACP, and he was a very fair Black man, fair skin, who often was able to pass this fight. So when he investigated some of these incidents, Walter White went in and was able to, really investigate them from the standpoint of not being seen as, as being a Black person. He may have gone there, as I said, because of friends with Walter White and trying to get the support of the NAACP.
I just want to say I applaud the work that both you and Dr. have done so far. It's always important when you get a chance to hear your history, especially history that's not spoken of in the school system. I will say it when I watched the story Lovecraft, when they used that as to talk about also race riots. A lot of people were like, wow, did you see that? Did you see that? And I'm glad that I came. She was glad that I was doing some research, and I love research. She said that, oh, come on, definitely going to that. So I thank you for sharing that information. It takes a long time to do research and to document it, and then to share it freely. So I just want to applaud their efforts and thank you for the research, the dedication, obviously, and the passion that you have for research. So I want to say thank you for sharing that with people that possibly did not know. So now you know. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a passion in a sense, because I find the stories and the people to be so inspirational, so instructive. And the fact of the matter is, that's what I want young people to understand, that again, you came from people who were very, very engaged, very bright, who worked against some awful odds And imagine, I mean, they were threatened. Their lives were threatened almost every day. And still they got up and they went to work. They got up and they spoke out. They got up and they did things that could have brought harm to them. And so hopefully young people and older people can be inspired by that, because we don't often have a lot of inspirational figures around today, and particularly with all the misinformation and disinformation and all the banning of books. I mean, I would think that Mr. Smitherman and his life story particularly would be one of those, and certainly the Tulsa Race Massacre itself. I mean, just the fact that the name has changed from riot, to massacre, that tells you again that that there's a lot of work to be done to get the story out, to tell the story accurately. And it does take a lot of research and a lot of blurry eyes sometimes going through things. But, it's quite fascinating to know how many, we might call them ordinary people, are heroes for us. One of the things with the Uncrowned Queens that really is our bedrock is that we say, we're looking for the little H history makers, not the big H history makers. Everybody knows them, but we have a lot of little H history makers that we need to know about, and we need to document their story. It's one thing to talk about somebody and this and that, but it's another thing to write it down. If you don't write it down, well, it gets lost. So that's my goal, is to write it down, make sure it doesn't get lost. Yeah. And I had some trepidation doing those readings in front of you. I thought, oh, there's a drama person in the room, and I'm not an elocutionist. Good. I know, we had to tie this lady down. I don't know. I wrote an article for the Heritage magazine, and this is from 2013, believe it or not, but I know they have copies. So I'm not sure if that's available. And other thing is, if you go on the Uncrowned Queens website, you can pull up a bio of Mr. Smitherman. It's not as extensive, it doesn't have a lot of pictures in it, but you can get a sense of who he is from that. And I'm working on another article. The article, I did write an article for this presentation for the centennial in 2021, because I didn't know about this article he wrote in Boston. I've been looking to see if I could find anything he had written after he left Tulsa, after he had to leave Tulsa. And as I said, his autobiography, he never got to write about his activities and his response to the race riot, but he did in this one article. So I've written about that, but I really need to see if I can get some of these things published more widely so they can be available. And I'm going to do that. I don't know, I'll have to ask the Michigan.
We did record it, and with your permission, we would love to share it.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you can do that. So thank you. So the answer is yes. Any other questions?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, we got an excellent presentation again, Dr. Nicole.
Thank you.
Very informative, like in regards to the 54 men that were found, were any of the survivors awarded any type of certificate or anything like that? And now I think that the ancestors that the pizza have been awarded, have been non-rated.
Well, there was and if we can go back, let's see, you can, stay in that one next one, the last one. See at the very end, State of Oklahoma character, that is the order. I'm sorry you can't see it small, signed by Tim Harris. Right, but that is, yeah, that's the order that was handed down, that the judge also, you know, passed, approved. I don't know specifically. I don't think so. I don't know how many of them, you know, would have relatives who were still alive. I do know one or two who were there at the ceremony that day. And I said, you know, it was a horrible day weather-wise, but there were people there at the ceremony, and they did have copies of this available. Yeah.
Answer some online ones.
Right.
We had a few people ask, what's the name of the poem and where they can find it?
The name of the poem is The Tulsa Race Massacre by Andrew Jackson Smitherman, and it's online.
The next question is from Terry Howell, and she wants to know, is there competition between Mr. Merriweather and Mr. Smitherman? One being a Republican, the other being a Democrat?
I haven't found any competition between them, but of course, yes, the papers did take a different stance. So the Buffalo Criterion was a Republican leaning paper, and they said Mr. Smitherman was a Democrat leading paper. So I assumed that there was some, you know, some rivalry. Also, Mr. Smitherman started a Democratic club, and I'm not going to remember the name now. It's like the Gem something or other, but there's a Democratic club that he started here in Buffalo that prevailed for quite some time.
The next question is, do you know where the Buffalo Star and the Emperor Star are archived, not if they are microfilmed?
They're at the Buffalo Public Library, Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. They are not digitized, unfortunately, but they are on microfilm.
And the last question comes from Dr. Peggy Brooks Bertram, and she wants to know what your next steps are with Mr. Smith.
The next steps, when we finish what we're doing now, as you have, the flyer was up for our coming event on Friday. The next steps are really, I think, to go back and compile a brief book that can be shared more broadly, that encompasses the things that you asked about. Yeah, well, they closed because of his death. Right? So he died in 1961. It ran for a little bit longer. One of the people who worked on the paper was Joe Green, I believe, who was the publisher, editor of the Muhammad Speaks. So he was and unfortunate, I didn't get to speak to him before he passed, but he wrote a little article on Mr. Smitherman, acknowledging, you know, his passing sometime. So I did get that. And the other one is Ishmael Reed, also worked on and so there are a few others, I think, and maybe George K. Arthur may have written for a while. So there were a number of young men who wrote articles or who were mentored by Mr. Smitherman in journalism for a while, but no one who really took over the paper. And I think, again, the fact that it was costly, and there were certainly times when I think the paper was in jeopardy of closing because of having difficulty meeting the bills.
One more thing.
Mhm.
I was thinking about what you were saying about the political parties, and that most of the Black were Republicans. What was the Trump? The Black Republicans.
Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it was really Blacks gave the Republicans under Abraham Lincoln the credit for the Emancipation Proclamation. And they're staunchly Republican. And quite frankly, the Democrats at one point really were, the Southern Democrats, they really were anti-Black. They were segregationists and very vile racists. And so that changed over the years, but that was the bind with the Republican Party. Welcome. Thank you all for your attention.
Before we close out, I just wanted to invite everyone back to our last two talks here at the library. We're gonna have more to our theory, interactive about Black history and talk. We have one Tuesday, February 21st, next Tuesday, with Austin BFO, today's radio sound and the civil rights movement. She was around, who's here with us tonight. Here, we Pettigrew. Also, the last Tuesday of the month, February 28th, we're going to have the Colored Musicians Club, introducing their Colored Musicians Club at Museum, preserving, presenting, and promoting the legacy of African American music in Buffalo since 1917. And there will be special presenters Danny Williams, President George Scott, and board member Craig Tiger, historian. So please come back and thank you again, Dr. Nevergold.
You're welcome.
Such an insightful presentation.
You're welcome. Brent, did you have a question?
Yes,